Tonight, we're going to build a world inside a machine and send it toward another star. Not a rocket, not a capsule, a civilization, sealed inside metal, carrying everything it will ever have, aimed at Alpha Centauri, roughly 25 trillion miles away. The people who board this ship will never arrive. Their children won't arrive. Their grandchildren might not either. Somewhere, generations later, descendants who have never breathed open air or felt wind on their skin will look through forward cameras and see a star growing brighter. They will be the product of centuries of isolation, recycled air, artificial gravity, and a culture no one on Earth could have predicted. This is what a generation ship would actually experience. And the hardest part is not the distance, it is staying alive long enough to cross it. Before we get started, if you love exploring the depths of space as much as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Also, before we begin, we're now live on Spotify. The link's in the description if you'd like to listen to us wherever you are. Now, are you comfortable? Let's begin. The nearest star system beyond our own sun sits in the southern sky, visible to the naked eye on a clear night if you happen to be in the right part of the world. It looks like a single bright point of light. It is not. Alpha Centauri is a triple star system. 3 stars bound together by gravity, hanging in space at a distance of roughly 4.37 light-years from Earth. That translates to approximately 25.6 trillion miles. In cosmic terms, this is our next-door neighbor. In human terms, it is almost incomprehensibly far away. The 3 stars in the system are designated Alpha Centauri A, Alpha Centauri B, and Proxima Centauri. Alpha Centauri A and B are sun-like stars, a binary pair orbiting each other in a slow gravitational dance that takes about 80 years to complete. Alpha Centauri A is slightly larger and brighter than our Sun. Alpha Centauri B is slightly smaller and dimmer. Together, they form the kind of stable stellar environment that immediately draws the attention of anyone looking for places where life might exist. Proxima Centauri is different. It is a small red dwarf, much cooler and dimmer than the other 2, orbiting the binary pair at a great distance. It sits about 4.24 light-years from Earth, which makes it technically the closest star to our solar system. That fraction of a light-year closer is why it carries the name Proxima, from the Latin word for nearest. In 2016, astronomers confirmed something extraordinary. Proxima Centauri has a planet. They named it Proxima Centauri b, and it is roughly Earth-sized, orbiting within what scientists call the habitable zone, the range of distances from a star where liquid water could theoretically exist on a planet's surface. Then, in 2025, the Near-Infrared Planet Searcher instrument at La Silla Observatory in Chile delivered its first science results, confirming Proxima Centauri b's existence with a powerful new spectrograph designed specifically to hunt worlds around small, cool stars. The same observations confirmed a smaller planet, Proxima Centauri d, and helped rule out a previously claimed third world. So the nearest star to our Sun has at least 2 confirmed planets, one of them sitting in the zone where the conditions for life are not automatically impossible. That fact alone makes Alpha Centauri the most compelling target for interstellar exploration that exists. It is close, it is interesting, and it might harbor a world worth visiting. The problem is getting there. 4.24 light-years does not sound that far when you say it quickly. A light-year is the distance light travels in 1 year, moving at roughly 186,000 miles per second. Light from Proxima Centauri takes a little over 4 years to reach your eye. So, if light can make the trip in about 4 years, how long would it take us? Here is where the numbers become uncomfortable. The fastest object humanity has ever sent into space is the Parker Solar Probe, which at its peak, velocity reaches about 430,000 miles per hour. That is extraordinarily fast by any human standard. At that speed, you could cross the entire United States in about 20 seconds. But point the Parker Solar Probe at Proxima Centauri, and the journey takes approximately 6,700 years. 6,700 years is longer than the entirety of recorded human civilization. Writing was invented roughly 5,000 years ago. The Parker Solar Probe, the fastest thing we have ever built, would not arrive at the nearest star until long after every language currently spoken on Earth has been forgotten. Voyager 1, the most distant human-made object in existence, is traveling at about 38,000 miles per hour. At that speed, the trip to Proxima Centauri takes over 70,000 years. 70,000 years ago, modern humans were still sharing the planet with Neanderthals. We had not invented agriculture. We had not built a single permanent structure. The entire arc of human civilization, everything from the first villages to the International Space Station, fits inside the time Voyager 1 would need to reach the nearest star. And these numbers assume the spacecraft could maintain their speed, which they cannot. The Parker Solar Probe achieves its velocity by falling toward the sun and using gravitational assists. In interstellar space, far from any massive body, it would gradually slow down. You would need sustained propulsion to maintain speed across the void. And sustained propulsion requires fuel, and fuel has mass, and accelerating that mass requires more fuel. This is the tyranny of the rocket equation, and it is the wall that every serious interstellar proposal slams into sooner or later. So the question becomes straightforward but brutal. If we want to send people, actual living human beings, to Alpha Centauri, what kind of speed do we actually need? At 1% of light speed, Proxima Centauri is about 425 years away. At 5%, it drops to roughly 85 years. At 10% of light speed, the journey takes approximately 42 to 45 years. These are the timescales that matter for any serious discussion of interstellar travel. Decades to centuries, depending on the destination and the propulsion capability. And every one of those estimates assumes a propulsion system far beyond anything that currently exists. Chemical rockets, the kind we use today to reach orbit and send probes through the solar system, are entirely inadequate. They are too slow by orders of magnitude. Nuclear thermal propulsion, which heats a propellant like hydrogen using a reactor, offers roughly twice the efficiency of chemical rockets. Better, but still nowhere close to interstellar speeds. Ion drives are real technology, used successfully on missions like Deep Space One and Dawn, but their thrust is so tiny that building up to even a fraction of a percent of light speed would take decades of continuous acceleration and enormous power. Nuclear pulse propulsion is one of the few concepts that gets into the right speed range. Project Orion, studied seriously in the late 1950s and early 1960s, proposed detonating nuclear warheads behind a massive pusher plate and riding the shockwave. The physics works. Computer simulations and engineering analyses conducted by Freeman Dyson, Ted Taylor, and their team at General Atomics demonstrate that an Orion-type spacecraft could theoretically reach several percent of light speed. But the practical barriers are immense. You would need thousands of nuclear weapons. The radiation environment behind the ship would be severe. And launching such a vessel from Earth would violate the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibits nuclear detonations in space. Project Orion was shelved not because the physics failed, but because the politics and the engineering complexity made it untenable. Fusion propulsion offers theoretical advantages. Fusion reactions, the same process that powers our sun, release far more energy per unit of fuel than fission. If controlled fusion could be harnessed in a compact engine, the fuel, hydrogen, is the most abundant element in the universe. Robert Bussard proposed a ramjet design in 1960 that would scoop interstellar hydrogen as it flew, theoretically allowing indefinite acceleration without carrying all your fuel from the start. The concept is elegant but faces severe practical objections. The magnetic scoop would need to be hundreds of miles across. The hydrogen density in interstellar space is extremely low, and the drag from collecting it may exceed the thrust the fusion produces. Beyond Bussard's ramjet, the fundamental problem remains that controlled fusion has not been achieved even for stationary power generation on Earth, let alone in a form compact and reliable enough for a spacecraft engine. After more than 70 years of research, commercial fusion power is still a future technology. Antimatter propulsion is the most energetically dense reaction known to physics. When matter meets antimatter, the annihilation converts the entire mass into energy. But producing antimatter requires staggering amounts of energy. The total quantity of antimatter ever manufactured on Earth amounts to less than 20 nanograms, barely enough to light a bulb for a few seconds. Scaling that up to the kilograms or tons needed for propulsion is so far beyond current capability that it belongs to a different century of engineering. And here is the thing nobody likes to say out loud. There is no faster option on the horizon that changes the fundamental calculus. Warp drives remain theoretical constructs with no confirmed engineering pathway. Wormholes exist in the mathematics of general relativity but have never been observed. And the exotic matter they would require, matter with negative energy density, has never been produced. The speed of light is not a barrier we are anywhere close to breaking. So, if humanity ever wants to send people to another star, not probes, not signals, but actual human beings who walk and breathe and think, the journey will almost certainly take longer than a single human lifetime. For any destination beyond the very nearest stars using the most optimistic propulsion we can seriously envision, the trip takes generations. That is not a problem you solve with better engines. It is a problem you solve by changing what the ship carries and what it means to arrive. This is where the generation ship enters the story. And it is a far stranger thing than most people imagine when they first encounter the idea. A generation ship does not try to make the journey shorter. It accepts that the journey is long, brutally, uncompromisingly long, and instead of compressing it into a single human lifespan, it stretches the crew across time. The ship carries not just a crew, but a population. People live aboard it. They work, they build relationships, they raise children, and then they grow old and they die. And the children they raised take over, and they live and work and raise children of their own. And this continues, generation after generation, for as long as the journey demands. The people who board the ship at launch know they will never arrive. They are choosing to spend the rest of their lives inside a sealed vessel, surrounded by vacuum, getting progressively farther from everything and everyone they have ever known. The people who eventually reach the destination, if everything goes right, will be their distant descendants, individuals who were born aboard the ship, who grew up inside its corridors, who have never breathed air that was not recycled through the same filters their grandparents breathed through. They will arrive at a world none of them have ever seen, around a star that has been a destination on a chart rather than a point of light in a sky they recognize. The concept is not new. It has been discussed seriously for well over a century. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the Russian rocket theorist who worked out the foundational mathematics of spaceflight in the early 1900s, was among the first to consider that travel between the stars might require vessels designed not as vehicles for a crew, but as habitats for a population. He imagined self-contained worlds drifting between the stars across timescales that would dwarf individual human lives. Robert Goddard, the American rocket pioneer, wrote about similar ideas in the 1920s, envisioning what he called an interstellar ark, a vessel large enough to sustain a community across centuries of travel. By the middle of the 20th century, the idea had been picked up by both scientists and science fiction writers, and the basic architecture of the generation ship had been sketched out in broad strokes. The concept is simple to state. You build something large enough to support a stable, self-sustaining human population. You give it everything it needs to last for the entire duration of the voyage. You launch it toward a destination star, and then you wait. Generations live and die aboard the ship while it crosses the void. Babies are born who know nothing of Earth except what their parents tell them. Those babies grow up, have children of their own, grow old, and pass on. The ship keeps moving. And at the far end of a journey measured not in years but in lifetimes, the descendants of the original crew arrive somewhere new. Simple to describe, staggeringly complicated to actually execute. Because every single element of that description, stable population, self-sustaining systems, lasting for the voyage, contains within it a cascade of unsolved engineering, biological, social, and institutional problems that no civilization has ever confronted in combination. And the difficulty is not evenly distributed. Some problems are hard but tractable, others are so deeply entangled with human nature that no amount of engineering can fully address them. In recent years, the generation ship concept has moved from pure theoretical speculation toward something closer to structured design work. The Initiative for Interstellar Studies, a non-profit organization based in the United Kingdom, has been running Project Hyperion, a study dedicated to assessing the feasibility of crewed interstellar flight using current and near-future technologies. In late 2024, Project Hyperion launched a design competition inviting interdisciplinary teams from around the world to submit concepts for a generation ship capable of making a 250-year journey to Proxima Centauri b. The competition drew hundreds of ideas from teams spanning architecture, engineering, and anthropology. In mid-2025, the winners were announced. The first-place design, called Chrysalis, envisions a vessel capable of carrying up to 2,400 people. Its designers projected a voyage closer to 400 years based on conservative propulsion assumptions, longer than the competition's baseline, but grounded in what near-future technology might realistically achieve. The ship is enormous, roughly 36 miles long, designed with rotating habitat sections for artificial gravity, closed-loop life support, and internal ecosystems capable of sustaining a human population without any external resupply. Chrysalis is not a blueprint. It is a concept, a structured exercise in asking what such a vessel would actually require. But the fact that serious interdisciplinary teams are now producing detailed designs, and that those designs are being evaluated against specific engineering and sociological criteria, marks a shift from generation ships as science fiction toward generation ships as an engineering problem that real people are working on. The population question alone illustrates the scale of what is involved. How many people do you need to start with? Too few, and the population loses genetic diversity within a handful of generations. Inbreeding depression sets in, fertility declines, developmental problems accumulate, and the population's long-term viability collapses. Too many, and the ship becomes so massive that no conceivable propulsion system can accelerate it to interstellar speeds within any reasonable time frame. Published estimates of the minimum viable founding population vary widely depending on assumptions. Anthropologist Cameron Smith, in a widely cited 2014 analysis for Project Hyperion, argued that a founding population of 10,000 to 40,000 individuals would be needed to maintain genetic and cultural diversity over a multi-century voyage, accounting for potential catastrophic events and population fluctuations. Other researchers, including astrophysicist Frederick Marin, have used agent-based Monte Carlo simulations, a code called Heritage, to model populations aboard interstellar vessels over hundreds of years. Marin's work suggests that under carefully managed social engineering principles, including reproductive constraints and genetic monitoring, a founding crew as small as roughly 98 individuals could maintain a viable population virtually indefinitely. The gap between 98 and 40,000 is not a disagreement about mathematics. It is a disagreement about assumptions, about how much control you can realistically exert over human reproduction and social behavior across centuries, about how many catastrophic events you need to plan for, and about whether cultural and institutional diversity matters as much as genetic diversity for long-term survival. The honest answer is that nobody knows the right number, because nobody has ever tried it. We have population genetics data from isolated communities on Earth, from island populations and geographic isolates, and from carefully managed breeding programs for endangered species. We can model what happens to a small founding population over many generations using computational tools. But the generation ship scenario introduces variables that no terrestrial analog fully captures. The population is not just isolated. It is sealed inside a machine, surrounded by vacuum, utterly dependent on engineered systems for every breath of air and every drop of water, with no possibility of outside help and no way to increase the gene pool once the ship departs. The margin for error is not thin. It is essentially non-existent over the timescales involved. And the population question is only one of dozens that have to be answered before the ship ever launches. Every system aboard, power, air, water, food, medicine, gravity, radiation shielding, manufacturing, education, governance, has to work not for months or years, but for centuries. Not under the supervision of the people who designed them, but under the hands of their distant descendants. People who inherited the ship and the mission and the obligation to keep everything running without ever having been asked whether they wanted any of it. This is the central tension of the generation ship, and it runs through everything that follows. The ship does not defeat distance, it outlasts it, and outlasting it means keeping a sealed human world, a fragile island of biology and culture and accumulated knowledge, alive and coherent and functional across a span of time that exceeds the lifespan of most civilizations that have ever existed on Earth. The Roman Republic lasted roughly 500 years. The Byzantine Empire lasted about 1100. The generation ship needs to hold together for comparable stretches, under conditions of confinement, isolation, and resource constraint that no terrestrial civilization has ever faced. The question is not whether we can build a hull strong enough to survive the void. Hulls are engineering. The question is whether we can build a society resilient enough to survive inside it. Whether the systems that keep people breathing can be maintained by people who were born a century after those systems were installed. Whether knowledge can pass from one generation to the next without critical losses. Whether purpose can survive the slow erosion of memory when the ship left behind fades from lived experience to oral history to myth. The journey to Alpha Centauri begins with a dream that almost every civilization has harbored in some form, the dream of reaching another world. But the generation ship transforms that dream into something the dreamers rarely anticipated. It turns the journey itself into a world. The ship becomes not a vehicle, but a home, not a mission, but a life. And the people inside it become not travelers, but inhabitants of a place that happens to be moving through the dark at a fraction of the speed of light toward a star they may never see with their own eyes. What that world looks like from the inside, how it breathes, how it feeds its people, how it keeps the lights on and the walls intact across the centuries, is where the real story begins. Everything a generation ship will ever have is everything it launches with. There are no supply runs, no emergency deliveries, no shipments of fresh parts or new equipment arriving from Earth 6 months after someone files a request. The moment the ship clears the solar system and begins its crossing, the total inventory of matter aboard that vessel becomes the permanent inventory. Every atom of oxygen, every molecule of water, every grain of soil, every milligram of copper wiring and surgical steel, that is the budget. For centuries. And the engineering challenge is not merely keeping those resources available, it is cycling them endlessly and without meaningful loss through systems complex enough to sustain a living human population, but robust enough to function without catastrophic failure for longer than most nations have existed. Start with power, because everything else depends on it. A generation ship needs energy for propulsion, for lighting, for heating and cooling, for air circulation, for water processing, for food production, for electronics, for medical equipment, for communications, for manufacturing, and for every other function that keeps a human community alive inside a metal shell surrounded by vacuum. Without power, the air stops circulating within hours. The temperature begins drifting toward the background cold of space. The water recycling systems shut down. The lights go out. Power is not one system among many. It is the system that all other systems require to exist. Nuclear fission is the most credible option available with technology that either exists today or could be developed within the relatively near future. Fission reactors generate enormous amounts of energy from small quantities of fuel. A well-designed reactor burning enriched uranium or thorium can run for decades without refueling. Modern naval reactors, the kind that power aircraft carriers and submarines, operate for 20 to 25 years between fuel cycles. A generation ship would need reactors capable of running for far longer. But the underlying physics is sound, and the engineering principles are well understood. The ship would carry multiple redundant reactor systems. If one reactor fails or needs to be taken offline for maintenance, others continue supplying power while the first is repaired. Backup power sources, possibly radioisotope thermoelectric generators or stored chemical energy, would cover critical life support functions during any transition. The reactors produce radiation of their own, so shielding between the reactor compartments and the inhabited sections is essential, adding mass but protecting the crew from the very energy source, keeping them alive. And here is the part that makes reactor engineers uncomfortable when they think about generation ships. Those reactors have to be maintained by people who were not alive when they were built. The engineers who designed the containment vessels and fuel assemblies are long gone. The technicians who installed the cooling loops and calibrated the control systems trained apprentices before they retired, and those apprentices train the next cohort, and so on across the generations. Every time knowledge passes from one generation to the next, through a training chain rather than direct experience, there is a risk of drift. A reactor technician who spent 30 years listening to the harmonic frequencies of a cooling pump can detect a bearing failure months before any sensor flags it. That kind of intuition does not transfer through a manual. It transfers through years of supervised practice, and if the supervision is cut short or the practice is abbreviated, the intuition dies with the person who held it. The reactor does not tolerate that loss. It does not forgive the gap between what the documentation says and what the system actually demands in the moment when something is going wrong. It simply fails. And when a reactor fails aboard a vessel with no outside help, the consequences are absolute. Fusion propulsion remains theoretically superior, but practically out of reach. If controlled fusion is ever achieved in a form compact and reliable enough for spacecraft use, it would transform the energy economics of a generation ship entirely. But for any vessel built within the foreseeable future, fission is what keeps the lights on. And keeping fission reactors running for 200 or 500 years, maintained by a lineage of technicians whose connection to the original designers is purely historical, is one of the foundational challenges the entire mission rests on. Assume power is solved. The next question is air. Human beings inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. In a sealed container, do that long enough, and the oxygen depletes while carbon dioxide accumulates to toxic levels. On the International Space Station, this is managed through a combination of electrolysis, splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen using electricity, and chemical scrubbers that remove carbon dioxide from the cabin atmosphere. It works adequately for a crew of 6 or 7 people on a station that receives regular resupply from Earth. A generation ship does not have that luxury. Its atmospheric systems must support not 6 people, but potentially thousands, continuously, for centuries, with zero external input. The most credible long-term approach is biological life support. Plants, algae, and photosynthetic microorganisms take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. This is the same process that made Earth's atmosphere breathable in the first place, operating over billions of years of photosynthetic activity. A sufficiently large growing area, properly managed, could theoretically maintain breathable air for a human population indefinitely, cycling carbon between the atmosphere and the biosphere using light and biology rather than purely mechanical systems. This is not speculation without evidence, but the evidence we have is sobering. Biosphere 2, built in the Arizona desert and sealed in 1991, was the most ambitious closed ecological system ever attempted. 8 people lived inside a sealed 3.14 acre structure for 2 years, growing their own food, recycling their own air and water through interconnected biological systems, and attempting to function as a self-contained world. The facility included a rainforest biome, an ocean with a coral reef, a savanna, a marsh, a desert, and an agricultural section. It was designed to demonstrate that a closed ecosystem could sustain human life without external inputs. It ran into serious problems almost immediately. Oxygen levels dropped unexpectedly and continued falling throughout the first year. The cause was eventually traced to soil microbes, consuming more oxygen than the designers had predicted. Compounded by the concrete structure of the facility itself, absorbing oxygen through chemical reactions. Carbon dioxide fluctuated in ways that were difficult to control. Some plant and animal species thrived while others crashed, destabilizing food webs that the designers had assumed would remain balanced. Insect populations, particularly ants and cockroaches, exploded beyond projections, while many other invertebrate species collapsed. Partway through the second year, supplemental oxygen had to be pumped in from outside to keep the crew safe. Biosphere 2 was not a failure in the way that word is usually meant. It was an extraordinarily valuable experiment that revealed how complex a closed biological system actually is. How many feedback loops and interdependencies exist that are invisible until you seal the door and watch what happens. It demonstrates that our understanding of ecosystem dynamics, while extensive in open environments, becomes dangerously insufficient when applied to sealed systems where every fluctuation is amplified because there is no larger biosphere to buffer it. A generation ship would need biological life support systems orders of magnitude more robust than Biosphere 2. Not just plants under grow lights, but entire functioning ecosystems. Soil with its community of bacteria, fungi, and invertebrates breaking down organic waste. Algae tanks capable of rapidly adjusting oxygen output as demand fluctuates with population size and activity. Multiple redundant biological pathways so that if one species crashes, others can compensate without triggering a cascade of failures through the rest of the system. And the people responsible for managing these ecosystems in Generation 6 or Generation 10 cannot consult a university biology department on Earth. They need built-in ecological expertise, diagnostic capability, and the ability to intervene in a biological crisis using only what is available aboard. This requires a depth of understanding that we currently distribute across thousands of specialist researchers and institutions, concentrated into a community of a few thousand people and maintained across generations without critical loss. Water is more tractable than air, but no less essential. In a sealed system, water can be recycled almost completely. Moisture from exhaled breath and perspiration can be condensed and reclaimed. Urine can be processed into potable water through multi-stage filtration and distillation. The International Space Station already recovers more than 93% of water from urine alone, and the total water recovery rate across all systems is higher still. Wastewater from food production and hygiene can be cleaned and recirculated. In principle, a properly engineered generation ship could cycle the same water molecules indefinitely, losing almost nothing. In practice, every recycling process has losses. Filtration membranes degrade over time and need replacement. Some water gets locked into biological waste that is not fully decomposed. Some is lost through processes that are difficult to prevent entirely. Trace amounts absorbed into materials, tiny leaks in seals that are individually negligible but compound across decades. The ship would need water reserves large enough to buffer these cumulative losses across the entire voyage. And the water recycling infrastructure itself must be maintained continuously and reliably by people working with hardware that may be centuries old. Spare components are finite. Manufacturing capability extends the life of those components, but manufacturing also requires raw materials and expertise. If the water systems fail completely, not gradually degrade but genuinely fail, the timeline from the beginning of the crisis to a genuine emergency is measured in days. The redundancy requirements are extreme, and every layer of redundancy adds mass, complexity, and the need for additional maintenance by additional people with additional training. Food is the most intimate of the survival requirements. Every calorie consumed by every person aboard has to come from something grown, cultivated, or synthesized within the hull. No imports, no deliveries, no foraging from an outside environment. The food production system is the ship's farm, and the farm has to feed a population for centuries without a single season of total crop failure that the system cannot absorb. Agricultural systems for a generation ship would center on high-yield, space-efficient crops. Wheat, rice, potatoes, soybeans, sweet potatoes, and leafy greens provide the most nutrition per square foot of growing area. Hydroponic and aeroponic systems, where plants grow in nutrient-rich water or mist, rather than soil, are more efficient than traditional agriculture in terms of space and water use. LED grow lights, tuned to the wavelengths plants use for photosynthesis, can make indoor farming viable in a power-constrained environment. NASA's veggie experiment on the International Space Station has demonstrated that edible crops can be grown successfully in microgravity using exactly these techniques. But feeding a crew of 6 with a small hydroponic garden is a categorically different problem from feeding a population of several thousand across multiple centuries. Soil-based agriculture would likely be necessary alongside hydroponics. Real soil, with its complex community of microorganisms, provides a resilience and biological depth that hydroponic systems struggle to replicate for all crop types. Soil also plays a role in the broader biological air and water recycling systems, processing nutrients and supporting the microbial communities on which the entire life support architecture depends. The ship would need substantial agricultural decks, not sterile factory farming operations, but something closer to working ecosystems, managed by people who understood farming as a living practice, not merely a technical procedure to execute from a manual. Animal protein is a more complicated question. Livestock require significant space, water, and feed relative to the nutrition they return. They produce waste that must be managed within the closed system. They have health requirements and need veterinary care, but they provide fats, vitamins, and micronutrients that are difficult to obtain from plants alone in the right combinations. More critically, they provide nutritional redundancy. If the grain harvest fails one cycle, having animal protein to draw on could be the difference between a manageable shortfall and a catastrophic one. Smaller animals are far more resource efficient than large ones. Chickens and rabbits produce protein with less feed, less water, and less space than cattle or pigs. Insect can convert organic waste into protein with remarkable efficiency, requiring minimal space, breeding rapidly, and filling an essential nutritional role without placing heavy demands on the ship's resources. Fish in enclosed aquaculture systems offer another protein source that can be integrated into the broader biological recycling loop, converting algae and plant waste into edible biomass. No single food source would be sufficient on its own. The ship's nutritional system would have to be a web of interlocking production chains, each one backing up the others, so that failure in one area does not cascade through the rest. Medicine deserves its own sustained attention because it is an area where the gap between what is needed and what is possible grows wider with every passing decade of the voyage. A generation ship at launch would carry doctors, surgeons, and specialists across multiple medical fields. It would carry pharmaceutical supplies, surgical equipment, imaging systems, diagnostic instruments, and laboratory capability for pathology and microbiology. For the first years, the medical infrastructure aboard would rival a well-equipped regional hospital. That sounds adequate until you think about what happens over time. Pharmaceutical supplies have shelf lives. Most medications begin to degrade within a few years of manufacture, losing potency as their active compounds break down. Some become not just ineffective, but dangerous, producing toxic byproducts as they decompose. A generation ship cannot carry a 500-year supply of every drug its population might need. The mass alone would be prohibitive, and most of those drugs would expire long before anyone needed them. The ship must be able to produce its own pharmaceuticals. This means chemical synthesis capability, the equipment and raw feedstocks to manufacture medicines from basic molecular components. It means biotechnology, the ability to produce biological medicines like antibiotics, vaccines, and hormone therapies using engineered microorganisms or cell cultures. And it means the expertise to operate these production systems, to formulate dosages correctly, to test for purity and potency, and to develop new treatments when a disease appears that the founding pharmacopoeia did not anticipate. That expertise is not a single person's knowledge. On Earth, pharmaceutical development and production involve chemists, microbiologists, pharmacologists, quality control specialists, and regulatory scientists working across institutional infrastructure that spans entire industries. A generation ship has to compress all of that into a medical community of perhaps a few dozen people and maintain it across centuries. If the last person who understood how to calibrate the bioreactor that produces the ship's antibiotic supply retires without fully training a successor, the consequences may not be apparent for years. And when they do become apparent, when a bacterial infection sweeps through a section of the population and the antibiotic production line cannot be restarted, because nobody alive understands the calibration sequence that was skipped during training 3 generations ago, the crisis arrives fully formed, with no time to rebuild the lost knowledge. Surgical capability presents a different kind of challenge. Surgical instruments wear out, blades dull, optical systems in endoscopes and laparoscopes degrade. Imaging equipment, if the ship carries anything equivalent to an MRI or CT scanner, requires calibration, maintenance, and eventually replacement of components that are extraordinarily difficult to manufacture outside of specialized industrial facilities. A generation ship would carry simpler, more robust diagnostic tools, alongside whatever advanced equipment it could maintain. But the trend over the voyage is toward less capability unless manufacturing keeps pace with degradation. And then there is the question of specialist coverage. On Earth, if someone develops a rare neurological condition or needs a complex cardiac procedure, they are referred to a specialist who has spent a decade or more training in that specific area. A generation ship cannot maintain specialist-level coverage across every branch of medicine. The population is too small. The training pipeline is too long. There are not enough patients with any given rare condition to keep a specialist's skills sharp through regular practice. The ship's medical professionals would need to be extraordinarily broad in their competence. Capable generalists who can handle a wide range of conditions, supplemented by detailed reference material and whatever diagnostic support technology the ship can maintain. But there will be gaps. There will be patients who need exactly the kind of care that nobody aboard is qualified to provide. And those patients will either receive the best approximation the medical team can offer, or they will go untreated. There is no referral network. There is no second opinion from a specialist on the other side of the planet. There is only what the ship's people know and what the ship's equipment can do. Chronic disease and aging add a slow, relentless load to the medical system. The radiation exposure discussed earlier does not remain an abstract number on a dosimetry report. It becomes patients. It becomes tumors that the medical team must diagnose, stage, and treat with whatever surgical and pharmaceutical capability the ship still possesses. Cardiovascular disease, arthritis, diabetes, neurodegenerative conditions, all the ailments that accompany human aging on Earth will accompany human aging aboard the ship, but with fewer tools to manage them. Preventive medicine becomes not just a good practice, but a survival strategy. The ship cannot afford to treat large numbers of seriously ill people when the treatment infrastructure is finite and the population that maintains it is also the population that gets sick. Screening, early intervention, dietary management, exercise programs, environmental controls to reduce exposure to known risk factors. All of these take on an urgency that exceeds anything in terrestrial public health, because the cost of widespread illness in a closed population with limited medical resources is not measured in healthcare spending. It is measured in the ship's ability to continue functioning. Mental health care belongs in this conversation as well, not as an afterthought, but as a core medical discipline. The psychological pressures of generation ship life, the confinement, the monotony, the absence of any outside world, the inherited obligation, the grief of disconnection. These are not abstract risks. They are conditions that will produce clinical depression, anxiety disorders, adjustment disorders, and interpersonal dysfunction at rates that probably exceed anything in terrestrial populations. Because the stressors are more constant and the relief mechanisms are fewer. The ship needs trained mental health professionals, psychologists, and counselors who can provide ongoing support, not crisis intervention after someone breaks down. And those professionals need to be embedded in the community in a way that makes seeking help normal rather than stigmatized. Because in a population this small, the loss of even one person to untreated mental illness is a loss the community feels in every system that person was responsible for maintaining. Artificial gravity is not an optional feature. It is a medical necessity. The human body deteriorates in weightlessness. Bone density decreases at a rate of roughly 1 to 2% per month. Muscles atrophy. Cardiovascular function degrades. Fluid distribution shifts in ways that cause vision problems and increased intracranial pressure. The immune system is affected. These are not minor inconveniences. They are progressive physiological damage that compounds over years and decades and becomes generationally catastrophic if children are developing in an environment without adequate gravitational loading. A generation ship must provide gravity, and the only practical way to do that with known physics is rotation. A rotating habitat generates centrifugal acceleration on its inner surface that the human body experiences as gravity. The larger the radius of rotation, the slower the spin rate needed to produce Earth-normal gravity, and the weaker the Coriolis effect, the sideways deflection that objects and people experience when moving within a rotating reference frame. At small radii, the Coriolis effect is strong enough to cause nausea, disorientation, and difficulty with basic motor tasks. Research suggests that a minimum rotation radius of at least 100 meters is needed to keep Coriolis effects tolerable for daily life, and larger radii are strongly preferred. Gerard K. O'Neill, a physicist at Princeton University, proposed in 1976 what has become the most influential large-scale rotating habitat concept. The O'Neill cylinder envisions two counter-rotating cylinders, each roughly 5 miles in diameter and 20 miles long. The counter-rotation cancels gyroscopic effects that would otherwise make the structure difficult to steer. The inner surface of each cylinder is habitable land, with alternating strips of terrain and windows running the length of the structure. At that diameter, the rotation rate needed to produce Earth-normal gravity is slow enough that the Coriolis effect becomes biologically negligible for everyday activities. The interior is large enough to contain actual landscapes, bodies of water, vegetation, atmospheric circulation, even something resembling weather. The psychological difference between living inside a pressurized corridor and living inside a space large enough to feel like a real environment would be significant for long-term mental health. Whether an O'Neill cylinder at full scale is feasible for an interstellar generation ship is debatable. The mass would be enormous, and mass is the enemy of any propulsion system. A smaller rotating section, perhaps several hundred meters to a kilometer in diameter, might provide adequate gravity with acceptable Coriolis effects, while keeping the total ship mass within propulsion limits. But the structural engineering challenges of maintaining smooth rotation for centuries are substantial. Bearings wear, vibrations accumulate, imbalances develop as mass shifts within the structure, people moving, equipment being relocated, water redistributing. If the rotation becomes uneven, the resulting wobble can amplify over time, stressing the structure and destabilizing the artificial gravity. Stabilization systems, gyroscopes, reaction wheels, and active balancing mechanisms would be needed, and those systems require power, maintenance, and expertise across the full duration of the voyage. Radiation is the threat that cannot be fully eliminated, only managed. In deep space, far from the protective magnetic field and atmosphere of Earth, the ship and everyone inside it are exposed to galactic cosmic rays. These are high-energy particles, primarily protons and heavier nuclei, accelerated by supernova remnants and other violent astrophysical processes across the galaxy. They are not stopped by a few inches of metal. The most energetic galactic cosmic rays can penetrate through hundreds of meters of shielding. No practical hull thickness can block them completely. The most effective shielding materials are those rich in hydrogen, because hydrogen nuclei are effective at absorbing and dispersing the energy of incoming particles. Water is an excellent radiation shield. Storing the ship's water supply in tanks surrounding the habitation areas serves a dual purpose: life support resource and radiation protection simultaneously. Polyethylene, a hydrogen-rich polymer, is also effective and lighter than metals for equivalent shielding capability. Some designs propose active magnetic shielding, generating an artificial magnetosphere around the ship to deflect charged particles, but the power requirements and engineering complexity of maintaining a magnetic field large and strong enough to provide meaningful protection over centuries are extreme. Even with the best practical shielding, the crew will receive more cumulative radiation over their lifetimes than people living on Earth. The question is whether that excess can be reduced to a level that allows a healthy population across generations. Cancer rates will be elevated. DNA damage will accumulate in ways that affect not just the individuals exposed, but potentially their descendants through germline mutations. Medical monitoring and intervention, gene therapy if available, and careful population-level tracking of radiation-related health effects would all be necessary components of the ship's health infrastructure, adding another layer of expertise and institutional capacity that must be maintained across the centuries. Micrometeorites and interstellar dust represent a different kind of external threat. Space between the stars is not empty. It contains dust grains, particles of rock and ice, traveling at whatever relative velocity the ship encounters them. At the speeds a generation ship would travel, even a particle the size of a grain of sand carries significant kinetic energy on impact. Over centuries of travel through the interstellar medium, the ship's outer hull will be struck by these particles continuously. Most impacts are individually negligible, but the statistical distribution of impact events includes those large enough to damage or breach the outer hull layers. Multi-layered hull designs are the standard engineering response. The Whipple shield, developed in the 1940s by astronomer Fred Whipple, uses a thin outer bumper sheet spaced away from the main hull. An incoming particle strikes the bumper, vaporizes, and disperses its energy across a wider area before reaching the structural hull beneath. Modern spacecraft use refined versions of this principle, and a generation ship would incorporate advanced multi-layer shielding across every external surface. But over centuries, the outer layers accumulate damage. The bumper shields erode. Microstructural fatigue develops in the whole material itself. All of this needs to be inspectable and repairable by people whose relationship to the original hull engineering is purely historical. A serious breach, one that threatens the pressure integrity of inhabited spaces, demands rapid response from people with the right materials, the right tools, and deep understanding of a structure that was built generations before any of them were born. Navigation is a domain that rarely captures public attention the way propulsion or life support does, but in practice it may be among the most unforgiving systems aboard. In interstellar space, there are no GPS satellites. There are no ground-based tracking stations. There is no constant communication with a mission control, providing course corrections. The ship navigates by stars, measuring the apparent positions of known reference stars and computing its own position and velocity relative to them. This technique, stellar navigation, has a long pedigree, but interstellar navigation is different in critical ways from anything practiced on Earth or within the solar system. As the ship moves through space, the apparent positions of stars change due to parallax, the shift in viewing angle produced by the ship's changing location. The faster the ship moves and the farther it travels, the more pronounced these shifts become. The starfield visible from deep interstellar space looks meaningfully different from the starfield visible from Earth. Familiar constellations distort and eventually become unrecognizable. The navigation systems must account for this continuously. They must measure stellar positions with extraordinary precision, compute the ship's actual location from those measurements, compare it to the intended course, and calculate any corrections needed. All of this requires functioning instruments and the trained expertise to use them correctly. A navigational error that produces a small course deviation early in the voyage can, if undetected and uncorrected, result in the ship missing its target system entirely. The destination is a tiny point in an enormous volume, a fraction of a degree of sustained error, compounded across decades or centuries, translates into missing Alpha Centauri by millions or billions of miles. At interstellar distances, there are no landmarks to course correct against. There is only the geometry of stellar positions and the precision of the instruments measuring them. Those instruments must be maintained to the same standard of accuracy across the entire voyage. The telescopes used for position fixing need clean optics, stable mounts, and calibration references that remain valid over centuries. Gyroscopes that track the ship's orientation must function without drift accumulating beyond correctable limits. Accelerometers that measure velocity changes need periodic verification against independent stellar measurements. If any of these systems degrade, the quality of the navigational solution degrades with them, and the crew may not know it until the error has grown large enough to be visible in the star positions themselves, by which point the correction required may exceed what the propulsion system can provide. The people responsible for navigation in the final decades of the approach cannot afford to be less competent than the people who set the initial course. The instruments must be as precise. The methods must be understood at the same depth. The culture of rigor around navigation must be as strong in the last generation as it was in the first. A ship that arrives at the wrong coordinates after centuries of travel has not merely failed. It has expended the total effort of every generation that lived aboard and delivered nothing. And here's the realization that ties every system together. None of these domains exists in isolation. The air system depends on the agricultural system, which depends on the water system, which depends on the power system, which depends on the reactor maintenance capability, which depends on the knowledge and training of the people who do the maintaining, which depends on the educational system, which depends on the governance structure that allocates resources to education, which depends on the social stability of the community, which depends in part on the food supply, the air quality, the water purity, and the psychological well-being that adequate living space and artificial gravity provide. Every system feeds into every other system. A failure in one area does not stay contained. It propagates through the web of interdependencies, and the further it propagates before it is caught and corrected, the harder it becomes to reverse. This is what makes a generation ship fundamentally different from any spacecraft that has ever been built. A spacecraft like the International Space Station is a machine that humans operate. It is complicated, but its complexity is bounded. When something breaks, there is a procedure. When the procedure is insufficient, there is a team on the ground with access to the full breadth of human technical knowledge and industrial capability. A generation ship is not a machine that humans operate. It is a world that humans inhabit, and the distinction matters enormously because a world has emergent properties that no design document fully anticipates. Systems interact in ways that become visible only under conditions the designers never simulated. Biological communities evolve. Mechanical systems age in patterns that diverge from their maintenance schedules. And human communities develop behaviors, cultures, and institutional dynamics that no founding charter can fully predict or control. The ship that launches is a design system. The ship that arrives, if it arrives, is something that has been shaped by centuries of use, adaptation, improvisation, failure, and recovery. It will not look like what the designers intended. It will look like what the inhabitants made of it, generation by generation, crisis by crisis, repair by repair. Some of those adaptations will be brilliant, some will be desperate. Some will introduce vulnerabilities that do not become apparent until the next generation discovers them the hard way. The container matters, but keeping the container intact is only half the problem. The other half, the harder half, is keeping the civilization inside it coherent enough to maintain the container. That is where the story turns from engineering to something far more uncertain. The human beings who live inside the machine, and the question of what happens to them across the generations that the machine demands. The founders chose this. They stood on solid ground, breathed unrecycled air, looked at a sky that stretched to a horizon no wall interrupted, and they decided to leave all of it behind. Whatever their reasons, curiosity, conviction, desperation, legacy, they made a conscious decision. They understood what they were giving up. They knew they would never return. They accepted the trade, their world for a mission, and they boarded. Their children did not make that choice. Their children were born inside a metal vessel, moving through interstellar space at a fraction of the speed of light. They opened their eyes for the first time under artificial lighting. They took their first breaths of air that had been exhaled and filtered and recirculated through the same biological and mechanical systems that processed it for everyone else aboard. They learned to walk on a surface that curved slightly upward in the distance because the floor was the inside of a rotating cylinder. The sky above them, if there was a visual simulation of sky at all, did not move. The weather did not change unless a system adjusted it. There was no outside. There was no option to leave. The ship was not their vehicle. It was their entire world, and nobody asked them whether they wanted it. This is not a side effect of the generation ship concept. It is the mechanism. The entire architecture depends on people being born into a situation they did not choose, inheriting a mission they did not agree to, and maintaining systems they did not design, for a destination most of them will never see. Every generation after the first is, in a meaningful sense, conscripted by birth into an obligation created by ancestors who had the luxury of choice that their descendants do not share. The psychological weight of this is unlike anything in existing human experience. The closest analogues we have are imperfect, but they are instructive. Researchers studying Antarctic winter overcruise, the small groups of scientists and support personnel who spend the southern winter at stations near the South Pole in months of total darkness and extreme isolation, consistently document a pattern they call winter over syndrome. It includes cognitive slowing, measurable deficits in memory and concentration, emotional blunting, increased irritability, interpersonal friction, and a diffuse low-grade depression that settles over the group as the months of confinement accumulate. Sleep disruption is nearly universal. Motivation declines. Social bonds that were strong at the beginning of the deployment become strained under the pressure of constant proximity without respite. These effects appear reliably, and they appear in people who know the isolation ends. They know the supply plane is coming in the spring. They know they will rotate home. They know the world outside the station still exists and is waiting for them. That knowledge, the certainty that confinement is temporary, is a psychological anchor that sustains people through the difficult months. Remove that anchor, tell someone that the confinement is permanent, that there is no rotation home, no supply plane, no spring, and you remove the single most important coping mechanism that isolated populations rely on. Submarine crews offer another partial parallel. Nuclear submarines deploy for months at a time in enclosed environments with limited space, recycled air, no natural light, and no possibility of stepping outside. Research on submarine deployments documents elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and interpersonal conflict that worsen with the deployment length. Crews develop coping strategies, routines, and informal support systems to manage the stress. But submarine deployments end. The boat surfaces. The crew goes home. The confinement was a tour of duty, not a life sentence. A generation ship removes the endpoint entirely. The people aboard know that the ship is their entire world, not temporarily, but permanently. They will never walk under an open sky. They will never feel weather that was not manufactured by a climate control system. They will never encounter a stranger, never visit a place their neighbors have not also been, never experience the kind of solitude that comes from being genuinely alone in a landscape larger than any human structure. Every day for the rest of their lives, they will see the same corridors, eat food grown in the same compartments, breathe air processed by the same systems, and interact with the same finite group of people. And so will their children, and their grandchildren, for as long as the voyage lasts. The social dynamics that develop under these conditions are difficult to predict with confidence. Small communities under sustained stress can respond in two broadly different ways. They can become exceptionally tight and resilient, people depending on each other deeply, valuing relationships with an intensity that only shared hardship produces, developing bonds that are stronger than almost anything found in open societies where alternatives exist. Or they can fracture. Factions form around real or perceived differences. Grievances accumulate because there is no mechanism for distance. Resentments that in an open society would dissipate as one party moves away. Changes jobs, relocates to a different city, instead remain in the room with everyone involved. The person you had a serious conflict with yesterday is sitting across from you at breakfast this morning, and tomorrow morning, and every morning for decades. Conflict resolution aboard a generation ship is not a policy preference. It is a survival system. Without effective, trusted mechanisms for addressing genuine grievances, hearing people who feel wronged, providing paths toward resolution that do not require either submission or permanent hostility, interpersonal conflicts accumulate. They do not dissipate naturally the way they can in an open society where people can create distance. They stay, and they compound, and they slowly corrode the social fabric that the entire mission depends on. The ship needs not just rules, but processes. Not just penalties for wrongdoing, but genuine pathways for people to feel that justice is accessible and that their grievances are taken seriously. Without that, the community's cohesion degrades quietly over years and decades until the social structure is more fragile than anyone is willing to admit. Governance is where the social challenge becomes institutional, and it may ultimately matter more than any engineering decision made during the ship's design. The people who board the ship agree to the mission. They accept the command structure or sign the founding charter or ratify the Constitution. They have legitimate authority over their own governance because they consented to it. But their children did not consent. Their grandchildren did not consent. And the people who actually arrive at the destination, perhaps 200 or 300 years after departure, are living under a governance framework they had absolutely no part in creating. Subject to rules and obligations written by ancestors they may regard as having no particular authority over their lives. The Mayflower Compact, signed aboard the Mayflower in 1620, was an early attempt to address a version of this problem. A small group of people, cut loose from established authority on a voyage to an unknown destination, tried to create a framework for governing themselves in a situation that nobody had fully planned for. It was a single page of text. It worked, more or less, for a single crossing of the Atlantic. A generation ship would need something far more sophisticated. Something that could adapt as circumstances change across centuries, granting the people actually alive genuine authority over their own community while also protecting the mission itself from being abandoned by a majority vote of people who have decided, perhaps rationally, that they no longer care about a destination their great-great-grandparents chose. This tension between the rights of the living population and the inherited obligations of the founding generation is not a problem that any existing political philosophy has cleanly resolved. It is connected to deep questions about intergenerational justice and consent that philosophers have debated for centuries without reaching consensus. On Earth, these questions are abstract. On a generation ship, they are operational. If the fourth generation decides by majority vote to change course, to slow down, to repurpose the ship as a permanent habitat rather than continuing to a destination that feels irrelevant to their lives, the mission ends. The investment of the founding generation, the sacrifice of everyone who came before, is nullified by the democratic will of people who never asked to be on the ship in the first place. Some researchers propose a layered constitutional structure. A core of inviolable principles, those protecting the mission's fundamental requirements and the basic rights of everyone aboard, that cannot be changed by any vote. And a broader body of law and governance that can be revised by the living population through legitimate democratic processes. The challenge is deciding which principles are inviolable and which are not, and ensuring that the inviolable category does not become a mechanism through which the founding generation's preferences permanently override the autonomy of every generation that follows. There is no perfect solution, but the generation ship that does not think carefully about this before launch has already planted the seeds of a governance crisis that could emerge at any point when the living population decides the obligations they inherited are not ones they are willing to carry. The genetic dimension of the population problem adds biological constraints to the social ones. Genetic diversity is the deep reserve of resilience in any population. When a new disease appears or an environmental stress shifts conditions, the variation within the population is what allows some individuals to cope better than others, enabling the group to survive and adapt. Reduce that diversity and you reduce the population's capacity to respond to challenges it has not yet faced. Push diversity low enough, and you begin to see the accumulation of harmful recessive traits, reduced fertility, increased rates of developmental problems, compromised immune function, a gradual decline in reproductive viability that accelerates as the generations pass. This is not theoretical. It has been documented in isolated human populations on Earth, in island communities and geographic pockets where limited gene flow over generations produced measurable genetic effects. The question for a generation ship is how to maintain sufficient diversity within a population that is sealed off from any external gene pool for the entire duration of the voyage. The founding population carries a fixed amount of genetic variation. Natural reproduction within a small, closed group inevitably narrows that variation over time through genetic drift. The random fluctuations in allele frequency that become pronounced in small populations. Maintaining diversity requires reproductive management, ensuring no particular family lines dominate the genetic pool, that pairings maximize genetic breadth, and that the population avoids bottlenecks from small cohort sizes. But this demands a kind of social engineering around reproduction that sits uncomfortably alongside the value most human cultures place on reproductive autonomy. You are asking people to consider the genetic health of the entire population as a factor in their most intimate personal decisions, in who they form partnerships with, and potentially in how many children they have. The ethical discomfort is real, and it cannot be dismissed by pointing to the biological necessity, because the people being asked to comply are the same people whose autonomy the governance system is supposed to protect. One partial solution is frozen genetic material. A vast library of cryopreserved sperm, eggs, and embryos from donors on Earth, representing far greater genetic diversity than any reasonably sized living crew could carry in their bodies. These could be used to introduce fresh genetic material at intervals throughout the voyage, supplementing natural reproduction and counteracting the narrowing that isolation inevitably produces. The technology for cryopreservation of reproductive cells exists today, though maintaining frozen samples viable for centuries requires solving preservation challenges that current methods have not fully addressed. A generation ship equipped with a sufficiently large and well-maintained genetic library could sustain much higher effective population diversity than its actual living headcount would suggest. But the library itself is a system that must be maintained, powered, monitored, and used correctly by people whose training in reproductive biotechnology has to remain current across the full span of the voyage. The children born aboard the ship are the living embodiment of every choice the mission made and every compromise the community accepted. Their developmental environment is unlike anything human biology was shaped for. The immune system develops in part through exposure to diverse microbial environments during early childhood. Children raised in highly controlled, limited microbial settings may develop immune responses calibrated differently from those of people raised in contact with the full biological richness of a planetary surface. The ship's microbiome, the total community of microorganisms living within the vessel, is a closed system that will drift over time, losing some species and amplifying others. Managing that microbiome is not just an air quality concern. It is a developmental health concern for every child born aboard. Musculoskeletal development depends on appropriate gravitational loading during growth. If the ship's artificial gravity is well calibrated and consistent, this should not pose a severe problem. But any deviation, a lower effective gravity in certain sections, uneven distribution across the habitat, periods of reduced rotation during maintenance or emergency, can affect bone density and muscle development in ways that compound across generations. The first generation adapts. The second shows subtle differences. By the fifth, if the gravity environment has not been carefully maintained, the cumulative effects on the population's physical baseline could be clinically significant. Vision development is another concern that seems minor in isolation, but multiplies over time. Human vision calibrates during childhood in response to the visual environment. Children who spend their formative years in spaces with limited distance vision, restricted outdoor exposure, and consistently indoor lighting show higher rates of myopia. The architectural design of the ship's habitats, the deliberate creation of spaces with sufficient visual range and varied focal distances, is a genuine medical consideration. Not catastrophic on its own, but part of a pattern. Every small developmental pressure that the ship's environment exerts on growing children adds to a cumulative drift in the population's physical and neurological baseline that, left unmonitored across enough generations, could become meaningful. The psychological formation of children born aboard may be the most uncertain variable in the entire enterprise. Developmental research suggests that children are remarkably adaptable to their formative environment. They calibrate to what is normal based on what they experience. A child raised on a generation ship will not feel deprived of open sky the way an adult who grew up on Earth would, because the ship's environment is simply the world to them. They have no basis for comparison. This is both reassuring and sobering. It means the children will cope, but it also means they will be genuinely different from the founding generation in ways their formative experience produces. Their intuitions, their emotional responses to confinement and proximity, their relationship to concepts like wilderness, solitude, and open space, all of these will be shaped by having grown up in a place where none of those things exist. The first generation aboard retains its connection to Earth through memory. They lived there. They remember what grass smells like, what rain sounds like, what it feels like to stand in a landscape that extends to a genuine horizon. The second generation has that connection only through what their parents describe. The third generation receives it secondhand, filtered through one additional layer of mediation. By the fifth or sixth generation, Earth is not a place anyone remembers. It is a concept, a story, an origin narrative that the community tells about itself. What that shift means for motivation, for cohesion, for the psychological relationship to a mission defined by a destination is genuinely unknown. The community may have developed its own robust internal identity by then, its own sense of purpose rooted in what it is, rather than where it came from. Or the loss of that connection might produce a kind of rootlessness, a disorientation about identity that manifests as social fragmentation or indifference toward a goal that feels increasingly abstract. This is what researchers call mission drift, and it may be the most dangerous slow-motion failure a generation ship can experience. The founding generation knows why they are on the ship. The destination is real to them because Earth was real to them. They remember what they left behind, and they believe in what they are moving toward. The second generation grows up hearing about Earth from people who lived there, but they have no memories of their own. Earth is a story told by credible witnesses. The third and fourth generations are further removed. Earth becomes historical, as distant and possibly as mythologized as any ancient civilization is to us now. And the mission, the obligation to maintain the ship, follow the course, arrive at the destination, becomes something inherited rather than chosen. An obligation passed down by people who are increasingly difficult to see as having legitimate authority over the lives of their descendants. Maintaining commitment to a long-term goal across generations is one of the hardest things any institution has ever attempted. Religious traditions have done it more or less across centuries and millennia. Cultural identities have been preserved across enormous stretches of time. But religions and enduring cultural traditions offer something that a mere sense of obligation does not. They offer meaning. They give people a reason to carry the tradition forward that is felt as genuine belief, as connection to something larger than any individual life, not as an imposed duty enforced by institutional pressure. A generation ship needs a belief system in this sense, not a religion necessarily, but a shared meaning framework that makes the mission feel worthy of the sacrifices it demands. Something the people born in year 150 of the voyage, who have never seen a star from a planetary surface and never will, can hold onto as genuinely theirs. Something that makes the meaning of the journey feel real and worth sustaining, even for those who will never see its completion. This is a problem of culture as much as governance, of story and ritual and shared practice, of art and music and celebration, and the space for genuine human creativity. These are not luxuries to be tolerated if resources allow. They are necessities. The things that make human life feel worth living are not separate from the survival mission. They are part of it. A society that loses its cultural vitality, that becomes purely functional and transactional, loses something essential long before any physical system fails. It loses the psychological resilience to handle the hard years, the motivation to transmit not just technical skill, but meaning. The belief that arriving somewhere and building something is worth the cost the journey demands. And beneath all of this, quieter than governance crises and slower than genetic drift, is the most underappreciated threat of all: knowledge decay. A generation ship at launch contains the full range of technical expertise needed to operate every system aboard. Reactor physics, ecosystem management, water chemistry, agricultural science from soil microbiology to crop genetics, medicine from surgery to pharmacology, materials science and fabrication, navigation and orbital mechanics, computer systems and software maintenance, whole engineering and structural repair. All of it, distributed across a population of specialists who understand their domains deeply and can teach what they know. The challenge is keeping that knowledge alive across generations. On Earth, we maintain complex technical knowledge through universities, trade schools, professional cultures, apprenticeship systems, peer review, and the ability to consult with experts anywhere in the world. These institutions evolved over thousands of years precisely because accurate transmission of complex knowledge is not automatic. It degrades. It simplifies. Details that seemed obvious to the person who understood them are omitted from the teaching because they seem too basic to mention. Procedures are followed without understanding of the principles behind them. And after enough cycles of transmission, someone opens a panel on a critical system and discovers, with a sickening clarity, that they can follow the checklist, but they do not actually understand what they are looking at. There is a difference between information and knowledge. Information is data stored on a medium, a manual, a database, a recording. Knowledge is understanding that lives in a trained human mind, that can be applied flexibly to situations the textbook did not anticipate, that can improvise when the documented procedure does not quite match what is actually happening. A generation ship needs that kind of knowledge, deep, practiced, adaptive, across the full range of systems that keep it alive. And it needs the next generation to have it equally, and the generation after that. For centuries, computer systems can store information redundantly and durably, but computer systems can also fail. Data can be corrupted by radiation damage or hardware degradation. Storage media that is reliable for decades may not be reliable for centuries. And even if the data survives perfectly, reading a manual about how to repair a complex system is not the same as knowing how to repair it. The practical component of expertise, the muscle memory, the intuitive sense for when something is slightly off, the ability to diagnose a novel problem by reasoning from first principles rather than searching for a matching entry in a troubleshooting guide that cannot be stored on a drive. It has to live in people, and it has to be passed from person to person, generation to generation, through direct training, mentorship, and practiced application. A generation ship would need to build something equivalent to an entire educational civilization within a community of a few thousand people. A rigorous curriculum covering every critical system. A culture of mentorship embedded deeply enough to survive generational turnover. An ethic that treats technical competence as a survival imperative rather than a career path among many. And that culture would need to hold with the same reliability as the reactor containment vessels, because the failure mode of knowledge loss does not sound an alarm. It happens quietly across decades. A slight simplification here, an omitted detail there, a generation that learned the steps but not the reasoning. And then, decades later, a crisis arrives that the checklist does not cover, and the person responsible for solving it realizes that the understanding they need was lost somewhere between their teacher's teacher and their teacher. And nobody noticed because nobody needed it until now. This is the landscape of human risk that a generation ship must navigate. Not a single dramatic crisis, but an accumulation of slow pressures. Each one manageable in isolation, each one compounding with the others across time. Psychological strain that builds without release. Governance structures that lose legitimacy as the founding generation's authority fades. Genetic diversity that narrows despite best efforts. Children who grow up calibrated to an environment no human ancestor evolved for. Knowledge that thins with each transmission. Purpose that erodes as the destination recedes into abstraction, and the ship itself becomes the only world anyone has ever known. None of these pressures announces itself with an emergency klaxon. They do not trigger automated warnings. They accumulate in the background, visible only in retrospect as a trajectory that has been bending the wrong way for a long time. The hardest thing about addressing them is that they require the living generation to take seriously the implications of trends that have not yet become crises. To act on projections rather than emergencies. To invest resources in prevention rather than response. That kind of institutional foresight is rare in human societies. Building it into a generation ship community and keeping it functional across centuries is perhaps the most ambitious piece of social engineering the entire enterprise demands. And yet the ship keeps moving. The stars and the forward cameras shift imperceptibly across the decades. The reactors run, the crops grow, the air circulates. Children are born and named and taught and loved. The community endures, not because it is easy, but because the alternative is unthinkable. And somewhere ahead, growing closer at a rate too slow for any single lifetime to perceive, a star waits. The question is whether the people who finally see it brightening in their cameras will still be the kind of society that knows what to do when they arrive. Whether the knowledge and the will and the coherence survive the crossing. Whether the ship delivers not just bodies to a destination, but a civilization capable of doing something meaningful when it gets there. That question cannot be answered until the final act of the voyage begins. When the destination stops being an abstraction on a navigation chart and becomes a point of light that is visibly, unmistakably growing brighter. Somewhere around the midpoint of the voyage, a transition happens that nobody marks on a calendar. There is no ceremony for it. No alarm sounds. No announcement is made over the ship's communication system. It simply becomes true, gradually and then completely, that the ship is alone. Communication with Earth does not end in a single dramatic moment. It thins. In the early years of the voyage, while the ship is still within or just beyond the solar system, radio signals travel back and forth with manageable delays. A message sent from the ship reaches Earth in hours. A response arrives hours later. Conversations are slow but functional. News from home is current enough to feel relevant. The voices on the other end belong to people the crew knows, colleagues at Mission Control, family members, friends. The connection is real and sustaining. But as the ship moves outward, the delay grows. At 1 light year from Earth, a message takes 1 year to arrive. A response takes another year to return. A round-trip exchange spans 2 years. By the time an answer comes back, the question that prompted it belongs to a different phase of the crew's life. The context has shifted. The people involved may have changed roles, changed relationships, changed their minds. Communication becomes an exchange of letters across time rather than a conversation. At 2 light years, a round trip takes 4 years. At 3 light years, 6 years. By the time the ship is halfway to Alpha Centauri, every message from Earth is more than 2 years old when it arrives. The news it carries is history. The political situations it describes have evolved beyond recognition. Its cultural references feel increasingly foreign as the ship's own culture develops independently. The people the crew once knew on Earth have aged, retired, moved on, or passed away. The institution that launched the mission may have been restructured, defunded, or folded into something else. The world the crew left behind is changing without them, and the reports they receive are snapshots of a world that no longer exists by the time the light carrying them reaches the ship's antenna, and the signal itself weakens. Transmitting across interstellar distances requires enormous power and highly directional antennas. Receiving from Earth requires equipment sensitive enough to detect signals that have spread and faded across light years of expanding space. The ship's communication hardware, like everything else aboard, ages. Components degrade. Antenna alignment systems drift. Amplifiers lose sensitivity. Replacement parts are drawn from finite stocks or manufactured from diminishing raw materials by technicians whose training may be 1 generation removed from the people who installed the original systems. At some point, the connection to Earth becomes unreliable. Messages arrive garbled or incomplete. Transmissions from the ship go unanswered, and it becomes impossible to know whether the silence means Earth stopped listening, Earth stopped transmitting, or the ship's receivers can no longer detect what Earth is sending. The fade is not sudden. It happens over years, perhaps decades. The voices from home grow quieter. The news arrives later and later. The cultural threads connecting the ship to its origin thin until they are barely perceptible. And then, they are gone. This moment, the moment the ship becomes functionally disconnected from Earth, as one of the most psychologically significant transitions in the entire voyage. It is a loss, genuine and profound. Not a death because Earth presumably still exists, but an ending. The ship's community is no longer a mission sent from somewhere. It is an independent civilization. the only civilization its people have. Whatever happens from this point forward, they handle it with what they carry. No consultation, no guidance, no reassurance from people who share their history and understand their purpose. Just the ship, the crew, the systems, and the dark. The loss needs to be acknowledged. Communities process grief through recognition, through marking what has changed, and creating space for people to feel it. A ship that pretends the disconnection from Earth does not matter, that treats it as a logistical detail rather than an emotional event, risks pushing the grief underground where it surfaces in other forms. Depression, withdrawal, a diffuse sense of purposelessness that settles over the community and is difficult to name because nobody officially acknowledged the thing that caused it. The ship's culture needs rituals for this, ways of honoring what was lost while affirming what remains. This is not sentimentality. It is institutional psychological hygiene, and it matters as much as any filtration system aboard. Meanwhile, the ship itself is aging. This is the dimension of the problem that receives the least public attention, but may matter the most in the final decades of the voyage. A generation ship is a machine, an extraordinarily complex machine composed of millions of individual components, and every one of those components has a finite service life. Pumps in the water recycling system wear out, seals and pressurized compartments degrade, bearings in the rotating habitat sections develop play, filtration membranes lose efficiency, circuit boards corrode, lighting arrays dim, medical equipment drifts out of calibration. Fabrication tools, the very tools used to manufacture replacement parts, themselves wear down and need repair or replacement. For the first decades of the voyage, the ship carries spares. Shelves and storage bays stocked with replacement components for every critical system. Organized, catalogued, maintained in controlled environments to prevent degradation. For the next several decades, the crew uses those spares and begins manufacturing new ones using onboard fabrication capability, machine shops, polymer synthesis equipment, electronics assembly stations, metallurgical furnaces. But eventually the spares run out. The fabrication equipment itself ages. The raw material stocks are consumed, and the knowledge required to operate and repair the fabrication systems has to be maintained alongside the knowledge of how to use the things they produce. A generation ship without comprehensive manufacturing capability is a ship on a countdown. It is consuming its reserves without replenishing them, and on a voyage measured in centuries, the countdown reaches zero for some components sooner than anyone would like. A seal fails, and there is no replacement in storage. A circuit board burns out, and the fabrication equipment needed to produce a new one requires a part that was last manufactured 80 years ago by a technician who trained the person who is now staring at the broken machine, trying to figure out what it does. This is where knowledge decay and material decay intersect, and the intersection is lethal. A component fails. The replacement has to be manufactured. Manufacturing requires equipment. The equipment requires maintenance. Maintenance requires understanding. Understanding requires training. Training requires institutional commitment to education. Education requires social stability. Social stability requires functioning life support. Life support requires the component that just failed. The loop closes, and every link in it has to hold simultaneously. A break in any one link puts pressure on all the others. The ship that launched with redundancy in every system gradually loses that redundancy, component by component, skill by skill, year by year. Systems that started with 3 backup layers operate on 2, then 1, then none. The crew adapts. They improvise. They find workarounds that the original designers never anticipated. Jury-rigged solutions that keep things running, but introduce new vulnerabilities. Some of these improvisations are brilliant, some are desperate. All of them are testaments to human ingenuity under pressure. But they also mean that the ship in its final decades of travel is a different machine from the one that launched. It has been patched, modified, rebuilt, and adapted so many times that its relationship to the original engineering drawings is more historical than operational. The people maintaining it understand the ship as it is now, the ship of accumulated repairs and modifications, better than they could ever understand the ship as it was designed. And then, in the lifetime of whichever generation happens to be alive at the right moment, something changes in the forward cameras. One star, among the thousands visible from the observation deck, begins to grow brighter. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone would notice on any given day, but over months and years, measurably brighter. The navigation team, if the navigation systems have been maintained to the precision the mission requires, confirms what the crew has been waiting for. The destination star is no longer just a point of light, identical to every other point of light in the sky. It is distinguishable. It is closer. The approach has begun. This moment carries a weight that is difficult to convey to anyone who has not spent their entire life moving towards something they were told was real, but had never seen proof of with their own eyes. For generations, the destination was an article of faith, a coordinate in a navigation database, a concept taught in school and referenced in the community's founding documents. Some people believed in it the way people believe in established facts. Others believed in it the way people believe in promises made by ancestors they never met. And some, inevitably, stopped believing in it at all, concluded that the ship was all there was and ever would be, and made their peace with that. Now the star is growing brighter. The destination is real. And the crew, people who are born aboard the ship and will live their entire lives within its hull, must begin preparing for something none of them have ever experienced. Contact with an actual planetary system. The possibility of a world outside the ship. The end of the journey, or at least the end of this phase of it. Preparation begins years before arrival. The deceleration burn, if the ship uses thrust to slow down, must begin long before the destination system is reached. Trading velocity for time, converting the kinetic energy accumulated over centuries of acceleration into the ability to stop rather than fly through the system at a speed that makes orbital capture impossible. Deceleration takes as much energy as acceleration, which means the ship must have reserved enough fuel or propulsive capacity for this phase, a requirement that was built into the mission plan at launch, but that depends on fuel stocks and propulsion systems that have been operating and aging for the entire voyage. The deceleration problem deserves a careful pause because it is as consequential as the acceleration that began the voyage, and in some ways, harder. A ship traveling at even a few percent of light speed carries enormous kinetic energy. Stopping requires shedding all of that energy, and the physics of shedding it are just as demanding as the physics of acquiring it in the first place. The most straightforward option is the reverse burn. You turn the ship around and fire the engines toward the destination for as long and as hard as you fired them at the start. This works, but it roughly doubles the total fuel requirement for the mission. Every kilogram of propellant reserved for deceleration is a kilogram that could not be used for acceleration, which means the ship either travels slower to conserve fuel for the stop, or it carries vastly more fuel at launch, which increases the mass that has to be accelerated, which requires still more fuel. The rocket equation punishes this kind of arithmetic severely. A ship designed for a reverse burn deceleration is dramatically heavier at launch than one designed only to accelerate, and the additional mass cascades through every other engineering decision: structural strength, reactor power, agricultural capacity to feed the larger crew needed to justify the larger ship. Alternative deceleration methods have been proposed, each with its own trade-offs. A magnetic sail, a large loop of superconducting wire deployed ahead of the ship, could interact with the charged particles in the interstellar medium or the destination star's stellar wind, creating drag that gradually slows the vessel. The advantage is that it requires no propellant. The disadvantage is that the braking force is very weak. Deceleration by magnetic sail would take years or decades, requiring the sail to be deployed and maintained long before the destination system is reached. Superconducting wire must be kept at cryogenic temperatures. The structure must survive the stresses of interacting with the stellar wind at high relative velocities, and the effectiveness depends entirely on the density of charged particles in the space the ship is passing through, which varies and which is not perfectly known in advance. Gravitational braking, using the gravity of the destination star or its planets to capture the ship into a bound orbit through a series of flyby maneuvers, is another possibility. But gravitational capture only works if the ship is already moving slowly enough for the star's gravity to bend its trajectory into an orbit, rather than merely deflecting it slightly as it flies past. For a ship arriving at several percent of light speed, the star's gravitational influence is far too weak to capture it without prior deceleration by some other means. Gravitational braking might serve as a final refinement after the ship has already shed most of its velocity, but it cannot be the primary braking method. The consequence of failing to decelerate is final and total. There is no recovery, no second attempt, no workaround. A ship that cannot slow down flies through the destination system at cruising speed. At a few percent of light speed, the entire Alpha Centauri system, every planet, every moon, every asteroid, is traversed in a matter of hours. The crew would have a brief window to observe and perhaps deploy a small probe, and then the system would recede behind them and they would continue into the void on the other side, moving away from the only destination they were ever aimed at, with no fuel to turn around and no second chance. The mission would be over. Centuries of effort, generations of lives, all of it reduced to a flyby conducted by people who spent their entire existence preparing for an arrival that never happened. This is why deceleration capability is not a secondary concern. It is as fundamental as life support. A ship that can sustain its population but cannot stop is not a generation ship. It is an elaborate way to travel a very long distance and accomplish nothing. The fuel reserves, the propulsion system integrity, and the navigational precision required for a successful deceleration burn must be protected and maintained with the same rigor as the air and water systems, because without them, arrival is impossible regardless of how well the community survived the crossing. As the ship approaches, its instruments begin resolving the destination system from a point of light into a collection of distinct objects, stars, planets, perhaps asteroid belts or debris disks. The crew begins characterizing the system with whatever observational capability the ship still possesses. Telescopes that have been maintained across generations focus on the planets. Spectrographs analyze the light reflected and emitted by planetary atmospheres, searching for signatures of water vapor, oxygen, carbon dioxide, methane, the chemical fingerprints that indicate whether a world might be hospitable. If Proxima Centauri b is the target, the crew already knows certain things about it from observations made before the ship ever launched. It is roughly Earth-sized. It orbits within its star's habitable zone. It may be tidally locked, one hemisphere permanently facing the star and one permanently turned away. Proxima Centauri is a red dwarf prone to powerful stellar flares that bombard close-orbiting planets with intense radiation. Whether the planet has retained an atmosphere, whether it has liquid water, whether its surface conditions are compatible with human survival, these are questions that could not be fully answered from Earth and cannot be fully answered from the ship's instruments until it is close enough for detailed observation. The characterization work during the approach phase is not a passive process. It is an active, high-stakes scientific campaign conducted by people who must interpret data without any outside verification. On Earth, astronomical observations are checked, debated, replicated, and peer-reviewed across a global community of specialists. The Generation ship's science team has no such network. They are analyzing the destination system with instruments they have maintained themselves, using methods they were trained in by predecessors who were trained by predecessors. And they must make decisions based on those results that will determine the future of every person aboard. The instruments themselves introduce uncertainty. Telescopes whose optics have been cleaned and realigned many times over the centuries may have subtle performance characteristics that differ from their original specifications. Spectrographs that have been repaired with manufactured aboard components may produce readings that require careful calibration against known reference sources. The science team must understand not just what their instruments are telling them, but how much to trust what their instruments are telling them. A distinction that requires deep technical knowledge and the kind of scientific judgment that comes from years of practice. Atmospheric spectral lines that indicate the presence of water vapor, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and oxygen. Thermal profiles that reveal surface temperature ranges, reflectance patterns that might distinguish oceans from rock, from ice, magnetic field signatures that would indicate whether the planet has a magnetosphere capable of shielding its surface from its star's radiation. Each of these measurements narrows the range of possibilities, but none of them provides certainty. The crew will be building a probabilistic picture of a world they have never visited, using data that is good but not complete, and they will have to decide at what point the picture is clear enough to commit. And they must do this entirely on their own. Earth is more than 4 light years behind them. Even if communication was still possible, a question sent to Earth would not receive a response for nearly a decade. By then, the ship will have entered the system, executed its orbital insertion, and committed to whatever course of action the crew chose without outside input. The autonomy that physics forces upon the ship is total. The decisions made during the approach will be made by the people aboard, using the knowledge and judgment they possess, with consequences that cannot be undone. This is one of the clearest expressions of why a generation ship must produce not just technicians, but thinkers. Not just operators who can follow procedures, but scientists who can evaluate evidence, weigh uncertainty, and make consequential judgments under pressure with incomplete information. The founding generation can train the first cohort, but maintaining that intellectual culture across centuries so that the people who actually face the approach have the capacity for genuine scientific reasoning rather than rote procedure is yet another thread in the web of capabilities the ship must preserve from launch to arrival. And the crew must confront the possibility that the answer is no. That the world they have been traveling toward for centuries is not habitable. That the atmosphere has been stripped by flares. That the surface is irradiated beyond tolerance. That the temperature extremes between the permanent day side and the permanent night side are too severe. That whatever conditions look promising from 25 trillion miles away do not hold up under close inspection. This possibility, the possibility that arrival does not mean success, is one that the mission planners understood at launch, but that takes on a different character for the people who actually face it. The founders accepted the risk abstractly, as one variable among many in a mission plan. The people who arrive face it concretely. They are looking at a colored disc in their cameras, a world that is either going to be their new home or is not, and they have no alternative. There is no second destination. There is no turning back. If this world does not work, their options are to remain in the ship indefinitely, to search the system for alternative sites, moons, asteroids, or orbital habitats they could construct, or to accept that the voyage ends not with landing, but with continued existence aboard a vessel that was never meant to be a permanent home. But suppose the planet is viable. Suppose the instruments detect an atmosphere with promising chemistry. Suppose temperature models suggest that the terminator zone, the boundary between the permanent day side and the permanent night side, offers conditions that a properly equipped human settlement could survive. Suppose there is evidence of liquid water. The decision to descend is one of the most consequential any group of human beings could make. And it is made by people who have spent their entire lives inside a sealed vessel, who have never stood on solid ground, who have never felt wind that was not generated by a ventilation system, who have never looked up at a sky that was not a ceiling, however well disguised. The planet below them is alien in every sense. The star it orbits is not the star their species evolved under. The light is different. The gravity may be different. The chemistry of the soil, the composition of the atmosphere, the behavior of the weather, all of it is unknown at the level of lived experience. They know it only through data. And yet, the pull to descend is enormous. Not just because the mission demands it, though it does, but because the planet represents something the ship never could. Open space, a horizon, a world that extends beyond the walls. For people who have spent their entire lives inside a structure measured in miles, the prospect of standing on a surface that stretches to the curve of a planet is almost incomprehensible. Some will feel terror. Some will feel longing so acute it resembles grief for something they never had. Some will feel nothing, because the ship is all they know and the planet is a threat to the only home they have ever had. And here is the truth that the generation ship concept forces us to sit with. The people who arrive at Alpha Centauri, if anyone ever does, will not be explorers from Earth. They will not carry the memories or the intuitions or the cultural reflexes of people who grew up under an open sky. They will be the product of centuries of sealed world living, shaped by artificial gravity and recycled air, and limited social horizons, and an institutional culture that may bear only a family resemblance to the one the founders established. They will be human, fully and genuinely, but they will be a kind of human that has never existed before. Formed by circumstances no previous generation of humans has ever faced. Adapted to an environment that no evolutionary process prepared them for, carrying knowledge and culture and perhaps even language that has drifted over the centuries into something the founders would find familiar in outline but strange in detail. They will look at the planet through cameras and instruments. They will analyze the data. They will debate among themselves, using governance structures that are the descendants of structures the founders designed, but that have been amended, revised, challenged, and rebuilt many times over the intervening centuries. They will make a decision, and whatever they decide, descend or remain, settle or orbit, commit or wait, they will make it as the people they have become, not the people their ancestors intended them to be. This is the deepest lesson of the generation ship. You cannot design a society across centuries the way you design a reactor or a water recycling system. You can set initial conditions, you can build institutions and write constitutions and stock libraries and train the first generation of technicians and teachers and doctors and farmers, but you cannot control what happens after that. Culture evolves, knowledge transforms, people adapt to their circumstances in ways that are always partly surprising, because human development is not engineering. It is biology interacting with environment, interacting with individual variation, producing outcomes that no simulation fully predicts. The generation ship does not deliver a preserved sample of Earth civilization to another star. It delivers whatever that civilization became during the crossing. And what it became depends on everything that happened along the way. Every crisis that was handled well and every crisis that was handled poorly. Every generation that maintained its technical knowledge and every generation that let some of it slip. Every period of social cohesion and every period of fragmentation. Every child who grew up curious and motivated, and every child who grew up resentful of a life they did not choose. The founders accepted this. They had to, because the alternative was never going at all. They understood that the people who arrived would not be them, would not think like them, would not value exactly what they valued, would not see the mission the way they saw it. The founders did not launch a generation ship because they believed they could control the outcome across centuries. They launched it because they believed the attempt was worth making even without that control. Because the alternative, staying on one world forever, accepting that the stars would remain forever out of reach for any living human being, was a limitation they could not accept. And in this, the generation ship reveals something about the nature of human ambition that is worth sitting with as we approach the end of this story. We're a species that undertakes things we cannot finish. We build cathedrals that take centuries to complete, where the workers who lay the foundation know they will never see the spire. We plant trees whose shade we will never sit in. We invest in institutions whose full value will not be apparent for generations. We do this because we understand, at some level deeper than calculation, that the things most worth doing are often the things that exceed a single lifetime. That meaning does not require completion. That contribution does not require witnessing the result. A generation ship is the most extreme expression of this impulse. It asks people to give up everything they know, their world, their sky, their connection to the planet that shaped their species, for a goal they will never see achieved. And it asks their descendants to carry that goal forward, generation after generation, through hardship and monotony and doubt, and the slow erosion of everything the founders took for granted, until someone, someday, looks through a camera and sees a new world growing brighter in the dark. The ship does not defeat distance. No generation ship ever could. The distance between the stars is what it is, a void so vast that light itself needs years to cross it. What the generation ship does is something more painful and more human. It sacrifices normal human time to survive the crossing. It trades lifetimes for continuity. It accepts that the price of reaching another star is measured not in fuel or engineering complexity alone, but in generations of human lives spent inside a machine, doing the quiet work of maintenance and education and social cohesion and biological management that keeps the whole fragile enterprise from coming apart. The first people to reach Alpha Centauri, if anyone ever does, will not be astronauts in the way we currently understand that word. They will not be trained pilots or mission specialists who spent a few years preparing for a defined assignment. They will be the inheritors of a civilization that crossed the void. The great-great-great-grandchildren of people who once looked up at a night sky filled with stars and decided to go toward one of them. They will carry the weight of that decision in everything they are, in their biology and their culture and their institutions and their language and their understanding of who they are and where they came from. They will know Earth only through stories, through recordings and documents and oral traditions that have been passed down and inevitably transformed across the generations. Earth will be to them what the ancient world is to us, a place of origin that shaped everything they are, but that none of them have ever seen. They will tell stories about it the way all human communities tell stories about the places they came from. Some of those stories will be accurate, some will be embellished, some will have drifted into something closer to mythology than history, and all of them will carry the emotional weight of a world that was given up so that this journey could happen. And when they look out at the planet below them, this new world orbiting a red star in a sky their ancestors never saw, they will face the ultimate question the generation ship was always building toward. Not whether they can survive on this world, though that question is real and urgent, but whether the journey changed them into people who still want to try. Whether the centuries inside the machine produced a civilization that is curious and capable and bold enough to step onto unfamiliar ground. Or whether it produced a community so adapted to the ship that the planet feels more threatening than the hole they grew up in. The answer will depend on everything that came before, on whether the founders built well, on whether the institutions held, on whether the knowledge survived, on whether the culture maintained its vitality across the long, quiet, claustrophobic centuries of the crossing, on whether the children born aboard were raised to see themselves not as prisoners of a machine, but as inheritors of a purpose. And if the answer is yes, if the people who arrive are still capable of looking at an unknown world and choosing to meet it, then the generation ship will have accomplished something that no other human enterprise has ever attempted. It will have carried a civilization across the nearest impossible distance. Not quickly, not elegantly, not without cost, but intact enough to begin again on the other side. The stars are 25 trillion miles away, and the hardest distance in that journey was never the vacuum between them. It was the distance between who the founders were and who their descendants became. Between the world that was left behind and the world that was built inside a moving vessel across the silent centuries of the crossing, between the dream of reaching another star and the reality of what it costs to try. A generation ship does not conquer the distance to Alpha Centauri. It endures it, and the people who emerge on the other side, blinking in the light of an unfamiliar star, carrying the accumulated weight of every generation that lived and worked and maintained and taught and hoped inside that hull, those people are not explorers from Earth. They are the descendants of explorers from Earth. They are something new. Something shaped by a journey so long that it became a world of its own. And whatever they build on the other side, whatever civilization they plant on that alien soil or in orbit around that distant star, it will be rooted not in the world their ancestors left behind, but in the ship that carried them through the dark. The ship that was their home before it was ever their transport. The ship that asked more of its passengers than any vessel in history and received, generation after generation, the only answer that mattered. We are still here. We are still going. We have not forgotten why. Good night.